We were all soldiers whose job it is to fight the Queen's enemies.
It was very dehumanizing. You were made to feel you were nothing.
It wasn't racist. It was just, a fact of life.
The Second World War was not Africa's war. It was a European child, born and raised. However, when this unruly child of Europe threatened to consume her, the European ran to Africa for help. Britain came for its colonial subjects and forcefully recruited them to fight for her in the war. From 1939 to the end of the war in 1945, hundreds of thousands of Africans were shipped to Europe and put on the front lines. What Britain did not account for in their desperate attempt to win the war was that the colonial subjects they forcefully dragged into their war had their eyes opened by the events they witnessed in the front lines in Europe.
1942 nitwateithirie ngetha ile 1939 no thutha wa ũguo twaumĩra mbara-inĩ gũtirĩ kĩndũ matũheire. Rĩu nĩ ũndũ wa ũguo rĩ tũgĩtuĩka rĩu tũgũcoka ũkombo-inĩ, na rĩu nĩ ũndũ wa ũguo rĩ ũteti wagĩthiĩ na igũrũ rĩ tũgĩkĩona atĩrĩrĩ no tũkĩrũire na Ngeretha nĩgetha mehere bũrũri ĩrĩa ithuĩ tũkĩheana ta andũ arĩa angĩ.
As Ousmane Sembene of Senegal put it, in war we saw the white men naked and we have not forgotten that picture. This new realization lifted the veil off of the illusion about the superiority of the white man and those who came home from the war wanted their homeland back from the white colonialists. These veterans joined the struggle for independence. And even though most of them struggled for their independence through diplomatic means, others had to gain theirs through the barrel of the gun. They paid the ultimate price for their freedom and liberty. They bled and died for it, lost their families and loved ones for it, got tortured and killed for it, yet they remained persistent. For every soldier that fell, two more took his place, and nowhere was this truer than in Kenya. The Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, which the British settlers nicknamed Mau Mau to differentiate them from their loyalists, was a movement for independence that started in 1952. The Kenyan people had had enough of the white man's abuse. They had been kicked to the lowest of the low, so low that they were brutally beaten for failing to address little white boys as Sir.
Muzungu angiaukirire bawurege gukira wene kuburwa ngiburwa ni muzungu ucio nongi muringa wicokerio muringi akuringite no aringa bwana oguo we no wobwenjera nundu akuringa bwana na tikwora na abare ciake kana murayo ndo umwe nake riu ni kuona mundu wothe mutuni ogaukira no kerugamia wega nundu ni bwana na riria mundu mwiru aboragwo na njira teo riria kuringwa ni kwinyite agua kauga ndio bwana na ni kuborwa araborwa ndukuona iyo yaita kunikuo ocio niguo tuonaga ocio no kombo tari mwega.
This was the same year that Queen Elizabeth II took the throne.
We were all soldiers whose job it is to fight the Queen's enemies, and it was clear to us on the briefings that we were given that this was a major force for evil, and that we were there to take it out, to deal with it.
The clash between the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army and the British colonialists was at the time portrayed as a struggle between civilization and savagery. And for the brutalities and atrocities meted on the Kenyans during this time, it only makes sense that the British government who controlled the narrative would paint their supposed enemies in a way that justified their inhuman treatments of the native Kenyans. The British used their favorite colonial tactic, the divide and rule tactic, to pin one tribe against another. By the end of the struggle, 11,000 Kenyan lost their lives compared to the 32 British. The experience during this time was an exact replica of the Soviet gulags, except that the British were more extreme and brutal. They built concentration camps where they imprisoned, tortured, and killed prisoners. They arrested people without cause, tortured and detained them indefinitely, split up families, separated children from their parents. They had torture tactics just like Nazi Germany.
It was very dehumanizing. You were made to feel you were nothing. You're being whipped and kind of walking, you made to run on your knees, literally. You had to crawl until you sweat. Then you were made to stand for sometimes overnight under very heavy light. You had to be pushed and knocked around and frightened in so much that people had even to admit what was not true.
They would abuse pregnant women, forcefully aborting their babies and making them barren in the process. Men were castrated. In fact, castration was so common that any man who found himself in the Athi River camp was so to go home less than a man. Like they had punishment cells in the gulags. In the British concentration camps in Kenya, they would lock prisoners up in cubicles for hours, tie them upside down, pour water on them before severely beating them. Women were sexually abused, and they would take spades, hit them up, and place the red-hot spades on the backs of these women, after which none of the women would receive any form of medical attention. The same jets used to defend the British soil from German invasion was used to burn the African forests and villages as they hunted for African freedom fighters. These British forces were loyal to their queen, Queen Elizabeth II, fighting to defend Her Majesty's reign in a stolen land. Decades later, survivors of these monstrosities came together and decided to bring a case against the British government under the leadership of the same Queen Elizabeth II. The British government agreed that the alleged human rights violations did happen, but it was no longer responsible because after independence, responsibility shifted to the Kenyan government. It took 3 years for the survivors to win the right to take the British government to court over these human rights violations. And to this day, there is no apology from the royal family or the British government, because for them, it is just the way of life.
It wasn't racist. It was just, a fact of life.